Hello, this is an introduction to Blender for Digital Stone project aimed at anyone new to digital modelling. I'm going to give an overview of the interface and how to work with objects and edit them, and how to import and export and fix and modify your 3D objects if you've done scans. I should say that this is just a very basic introduction, and there are many better, more in-depth, free Blender tutorials online. It's how I learn. And for this exercise, I am presuming you have a mouse, ideally with a scroll wheel, clickable scroll wheel, or an Apple mouse. You can work with a trackpad. I find it a little clunky and definitely recommend a mouse, but you can do anything you could do with a mouse on a trackpad. And I also recommend working with a full numpad keyboard, i.e. with the numpad numbers on the right hand side, but again a normal laptop keyboard without a numpad is fine. I'll show you how to work around some of those things. Okay, so when you open up Blender, this is what you'll be faced with. So with your mouse, the very first thing we're going to do is use the scroll wheel to zoom in. It's just using the scroll wheel and that will zoom in and out. I've got an Apple mouse, so I'm going to hit Command and scroll, but with a normal mouse it's just using the scroll wheel and that will zoom in and out. The next thing we're going to do is click the scroll wheel and move our mouse around, and what that will do is move our view around. And with an Apple mouse, you can just move your finger over the surface of the mouse for the same effect. Then the next thing is to hold down Shift and click the scroll wheel, and what that does is it pans our view from side to side. So we can zoom in, scroll wheel, click scroll wheel to change our view, and hold down Shift and click scroll wheel to pan our view from side to side. Okay, so then using our mouse, if we zoom out a little bit, we can see we've got 3 objects in our scene, which you can select by left-clicking the object. We've got a camera, a cube, and a light source. And you can see up here on the right, we have a scene collection, which has each of our objects. Okay, so with the cube selected, what we're going to do is actually delete the cube. So I'm going to tap X for delete, and I should say at this point I use keyboard shortcuts and I recommend getting used to them, but any action you can access via the menu bars, and in some cases also with some buttons. But in most cases I'll just be sharing the keyboard shortcuts, and it's useful alternatives. Okay, so with the cube selected, I'm going to tap X. That brings up our delete menu, and we're going to OK that. We've got a 3D cursor in the middle. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but just if it's not in the middle, you can just hold down Shift and tap C, and it will just make sure everything is centralized. So now I'm going to bring up our Add menu. So that's Shift and A. You can see that brings up the same menu option here. So Shift and A shortcut, and let's add a nice irregular object, a monkey. This is just so we can see our object in different views. So I'm going to the numpad now. If you have a keyboard without a numpad, what we can do in our preferences is we go to Edit, Preferences, also Command and Comma, or possibly Control and Comma on a Windows. And if we go to Input, you can see we can do Emulate Numpad. Now what that will do is it will make your top row of numbers on your keyboard have the function of the numpad. It doesn't quite work as well because it's not visually up, down, left, right kind of thing. And then you lose the functions of what those numbers can do. So you can flip between them, it's up to you. If I tap 1 on the numpad, you can see we jump to front view, 3 is side view, 7 is top view, 9 is bottom view. If I jump back to front view with 1, then 4 and 6 rotates it horizontally, and 8 and 2 rotates our view vertically. Then also on the numpad, if we tap 0, that jumps to our camera view, and 5 finally turns off perspective and orthographic mode. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is do some basic transforms on our object. So let's start with moving it. We can tap G for grab, and we can see what that will do with whatever object is selected. So we can move the mouse and move our object. Undo, a couple of undos. Or what we can do is if I tap G again and then tap X, you can see that we're then moving our object constrained to the X-axis, or you can similarly do Y or Z. The next one is scale. So if I tap S, you can see we'll scale our object. This is different from zooming into it. We're actually changing the size of our object. And again, if I tap X or Y or Z, we can scale it relative to that axis. And then finally, R for rotate. If we just tap R, it's going to rotate it perpendicular to our view of the screen, depending on how we're facing. But again, for more precision, we can R for rotate and then tap X, Y or Z to rotate it in that axis. And you can do it by eye, and you can also type in a precise angle for it to rotate. So that was a rotation in the Z axis in 90 degrees. Another way of maybe more easily but less precisely doing those three actions is to click on this transform button here, and then that gives us this gimbal thing where we can do all of those things. We can move it in the different axes, rotate it in those axes, and see the little cube handles is to scale it in those axes. It's just a quick way of moving or rotating your objects around. So now we're going to look at a thing called the 3D cursor. Your cursor is defaulted to the select tool, but if I click on the 3D cursor, you can see if I click on the screen now, we can't select our object, but we're placing what is called a 3D cursor. And this is basically a point in the space where we can tell Blender to do things relative to that point. So, and we can also, if I tap N, we bring up this side menu, and if I go to the view, we can actually put in precise measurements for the 3D cursor. So, okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another object. Let's add, say, a cone, and I can click further across. But what I like to do is actually use a shortcut for the 3D cursor. So I'm going to go back to select, because it's kind of useful being able to select our objects, and just to teach you that holding down Shift and right click is a shortcut to placing your 3D cursor. Okay, so let's just add one more object, let's say a cylinder. Okay, so now we've got 3 objects in our scene. We can click to select them, but if we want to select more than one object at a time, we can hold down Shift and select our objects. Now if we grab or rotate or scale, we're doing that with 3 objects selected, and again you could do that relative to different axes. Okay, so now we're going to look at this little thing up here, transform pivot point. So it defaults to median point, which means, let's say we're rotating them, it's going to rotate multiple objects relative to their average center point. Okay, so we can also do that relative to, the bounding box is pretty much the same as the median point. We can do it relative to the 3D cursor, so then we can rotate or scale our object, and it's using the 3D cursor as an anchor point. Next one down, individual origins. If I now rotate, they are all going to transform relative to their own center points. Oh yeah, and then the last one there, which can also be useful, I suppose, is whichever object you select last when you're holding down Shift, you can see it's the active one with the lighter shade of orange. So with active element selected, now we're going to rotate it relative to our active object. And the next thing to look at is our transform orientations. We're just going to look at the first two for now. So if I turn on the transform gimbal, we are navigating in Blender's 3D space with a kind of a universal XYZ coordinate, which you can see is marked by these guidelines, and there's this little gimbal thing here which shows the universal XYZ directions. So when we are transforming, we're doing that relative to the universal XYZ. Now if I rotate, say, the monkey around and then try and scale it in the y-axis, you can see it's doing it relative to the universal orientation. But if I go to transform orientations and turn this to local, you can see that each object has its own direction, and it can be useful to be able to transform relative to the object's orientation. Okay, so some basic functions there. Let's just start a new file. So I'm going to Command and N or Control and N on a Windows, and I don't say that. Okay, so this we're back to our default screen. So we've seen a way of working with our different objects. If we want to actually edit the object or look at its geometry, let's click on our default cube, and we've got our different modes here. We're going to look at the top three today. We want edit mode, but the easy way to jump to edit mode is to hit tab on your keyboard, and that toggles between edit mode and object mode. Okay, so now you can see we've got the cube's geometry, and we're currently in vertex select mode, meaning we are working with the individual points that make up our cube. You can use edge select mode. I don't tend to use that very often at all, and that will select the edge between any two vertices. And finally, face select mode, where you are working with individual faces at a time. Okay. Another way of looking at our object in edit mode, so if I go up here to the top right, what's called the X-ray, we can toggle between that on and off. So if we want our cube to be invisible, so that means we can actually start to select things that would otherwise be hidden. We can see the X-ray geometry. And back in object mode, you can see that you can just about see the X-ray working there as well. So you might want to jump between the X-ray and not X-ray when you're working with your file. Okay, so back into edit mode, I'm going to jump to vertex select mode. Now this is a shortcut on your keyboard where there's a clash with the numpad. So yeah, so 1 jumps to vertex select mode, 2 jumps to edge select mode, and 3, and I should mention you can add to your selection as before with the objects by holding down Shift, and you will add to your selection. So if I hold down Shift, I can choose which vertices I want to work with. Okay, so let's go into edit mode, and I'm going to make sure my X-ray is on, and we're going to just learn a few basic modelling tools. The first one we're going to learn is a loop cut. If you tap Control and R, you can see now we've got this loop cut, which you can place depending on where you place the cursor. And you can see there, once I've clicked, it allows me to place the loop cut somewhere on that line. If I wanted it bang in the middle, I could tap 0. So let's just do that for now. Okay, so that's a loop cut, and you can see what we've done there is we've added some new geometry to work with. Oh, and keyboard shortcut for X-ray, Alt and Z. Okay, so I'm going to jump to face select mode now. Front. Okay, so I'm going to click this front face here. And the next thing I'm going to learn is how to extrude. So I'm going to tap E for extrude, and I'm just going to move this out. Just going to do it by eye. So I'm going to do a little basic exercise to make a very basic car object to learn some of the tools in Blender. So I'm going to do the same on the back, again, just for the purposes of this. It doesn't really matter too much, but I'm going to make a very simple kind of like toy car shape. Okay, so that's E for extrude, and then now I want a bit more geometry so I can start to make space for the wheels. So I'm going to do Control and R, and I want this running down the length of the body, but I want 4 loop cuts, so I'm going to tap 4, and if I left click to accept it, you can see I can place them wherever I wanted there, but I want it in the middle, so I'm going to tap 0 and press enter. And I'm going to do the same across the front and the back. 4 more, and 0, enter, Control and R, tap 4, 0 and enter. So now if I jump again to face select mode, it will jump back to vertex or edge select mode after you've added a loop cut. Make sure that I'm selecting the right faces, so I'm going to click these two, turn off the X-ray mode to make this a bit clearer. There we go. Okay, so I've got these middle faces selected. Now if I tap G for grab and tap Z to constrain to the Z axis, you can see we move these 4 faces at the same time. Okay, now we want to put a wheel right in the middle of these 2 points here. So I'm going to tap 1 for, or click here for vertex select mode. Now if I shift select these 2 vertices, we know we want the wheel to go right in the middle, so what we want to do is place our 3D cursor there. So now if I tap Shift and S, this brings up our selection menu, and we want to move our cursor to selected. So now you can see that our 3D cursor has been placed in between those 2 points. Now if I go to Shift A, add menu, but in edit mode it's a slightly different set of options because it's what you can add within the object. So let's, we could add a cylinder, but just so we can do the extrude again, let's do a circle. When you first tap circle, usually this little menu box should be open. For some reason mine was closed, but you'll need to tap on that, and we've got an empty ring without any faces, so what we want is a fill type, and let's just go with triangle fan. You can see that's giving us a wheel. Now you could set all of your the size and the radius, etc. of your circle, but let's just do that manually. So I'm going to tap S for scale that in, and then we want to rotate it on the Y-axis. So I'm going to tap R and then Y, and then hit 90, type 90. And then we've got a wheel. Scale that down a bit. And let's do an E for extrude and pull that in, and we have got a very basic wheel. The next thing I'm going to learn is selecting and deselecting elements within our object. So if I tap Alt A, we deselect everything, and A is to select everything. And actually a double tap of A also deselect. Okay, so with nothing selected, I'm now going to hover over my wheel and tap L, which will select the geometry it's over. So if I tap L, you can see it's just going to select that wheel. I could add to the selection by hitting L, and then I can take away from the selection by hitting Shift and L. Okay, so with the wheel selected, I'm going to jump to side view, turn my perspective off, and the next thing we're going to learn is how to duplicate something within our mesh, and that's Shift and D. And and you can see that's duplicating. Let me just undo that, do it from an angle, Shift and D to duplicate our wheel, but we want to constrain it to the y-axis. And then again, if I jump to side view, we can scale that in. Obviously I didn't do this precisely, so that's why they're a bit off, but it's fine for this, it's fine. Okay, and then with that in place, it can just, there are obviously ways that you could do everything very precisely, but for the purposes of this, let's just speed through it. And I'm going to tap L on the next wheel as the new wheel has automatically selected itself, and I'm going to do a Shift and D, and this time we want to constrain it, so we're duplicating our object, and then this time we want to constrain it to the x-axis. There we go. So if I go into front view, I can G and X and put that in place. Okay, so we've learned a few things there. Now, thereafter, I would recommend as an exercise to spend some time modifying the car using what you've learned so far. So, for example, I can Shift select these vertices, we can put on a transform gimbal thing, and we can use that. I still prefer using. Okay, and then in our select mode, you can see if you click and hold it, you've got some different options of how you can select. So I think it defaults as select box. So if you clicked and dragged, you can see it will create a box and select everything within that. X-ray is relevant to this. If it's off, it will only select things that it can see. If X-ray is on, you can see if I now click and select, it's going to select everything visible. Okay, I quite like to have my select as a lasso, and this just gives you a bit more control. You can go around and select the vertices you want. Turn off X-ray mode. So then it becomes quite easy to select vertices, grab and scale and rotate them in the different axes, and so on. Oh, and if you hold down Control while you left click and drag to select, that takes away from your selection. Another useful thing is if you hold down Alt and left click, it will select sort of connected loops or rows of vertices. And our pivot points also work in edit mode, so if I put on individual origins and then extruded and scaled, it would scale each face relative to itself, which can be useful as well. And then putting it back to median point, okay, you get the point. Okay, and we should learn how to save. So you can go to File, Save As, or Control, Shift and S, and then title and save your file where you want to. I'm going to go Control and N or Command and N on the Mac. And what we're going to do now is make a very simple figure, just to learn a couple more techniques, to learn how to use modifiers and learn a few more basic tools and techniques. Okay, so with our default cube loaded up, I'm going to tap 3 for face select, so I can click here, select this underside face, and this is going to be a head, and we want to make a neck. I'm going to E for extrude. I can just move it down a little bit just so you can see it, and then I'm going to S for scale, click to accept it, E for extrude, pull out a neck, E for extrude again. Let's scale that out a little bit, and then let's scale it out in the x-axis to make our shoulders, E for extrude, and we've got our body. Okay. Now we want to make some arms and legs next, so it would make sense that whatever we do on one side happens on the other one. True with the car as well, to be fair. Alright, so we go Control and R, and we want that right down the middle, very important. So we tap 0 and hit enter to OK that. Let's just jump to X-ray mode so you can see what's happening. Okay, so now if I jump to vertex select mode, what we want to do is let's just jump to orthographic mode. We want to make sure nothing's selected, Alt and A, and then you want actually you want your box select tool for this, and we want to click and drag over all of the vertices, not on the center line, onto the left of the center line, or you could do the right hand side, it doesn't matter. And if we tap X, brings up our delete menu and edit mode, and we want to delete vertices. You can see what we end up there now is with half of our shell. So now let's look at the modifiers tab, and that's this little area here, the icon of a spanner, and we want to go to add modifier, and we've got a whole load of options of different modifiers, but we want to look at the generate menu, and we want to go to mirror. Let's turn off the X-ray. If we jump to edit mode, put an X-ray on, the vertices are still the same, and what the modifier is doing is it's a bit like a filter in Photoshop or whatever. It's putting the mirror modifier onto that object. The geometrical information is just that half. So over here I can turn off its visibility or whether it renders, but okay, that's good. So now we're going to do another loop cut, Control and R, and we want to make a space for the arm, and then jump to face select mode, E for extrude, E for extrude, yeah, okay, and scale that down a little bit, E for extrude, you can maybe make a hand out of that in a bit. We don't want the legs to come straight out from the center, so we're going to add another loop cut here, tap 3, E for extrude, E for extrude, E for extrude, select the front face, E for extrude. Let's quickly give him a very bad hand. Okay, grab it in the y-axis. It's just all about adding geometry. There are different ways of adding geometry, but for the purposes of this, we're going to keep it simple. E for extrude. Scale it in the z-axis. Y-axis. I'm going to make some very rough finger and thumbs. Okay, and then something else we can learn is normally if you did an extrude with these 4 faces selected, it would extrude them as one single block as they're connected. So what we can do is, if I tap Alt and E or Option and E on a Mac, that'll bring up our extrude menu. Now it defaults to its extruding faces, but we want to extrude individual faces. And if I go to our individual origins and scale that, you can see it's actually pulled out 4 separate fingers. Okay, so we have a very rough human there. So what another modifier that can be very useful is, again, in the modifier tab, add modifier, generate again, and go to subdivision surface. And what that's doing, again, the geometrical information is the same, but this is kind of smoothing out our object. And if you look down here, we've got our options, and we can change how smooth that is. I would recommend you don't need to go much higher than 3. I tend to not go higher than 2 because it's adding more geometry than it needs. Okay, but again, if we turn off the visibility of those things, of these two modifiers, you can see what we still have is this basic shell. If we wanted to make this real, we can click up on this little arrow and apply it, or as you can see there's a shortcut listed, which is Command and A or Control and A on a Windows. So do that, and you'll need to be in this area to apply it. Okay, now you can see that we have got all that geometrical information has been applied, made real. The next thing we're going to look at is Sculpt Mode. So I'm going to make sure my options are visible here. So if you click on, unhelpfully, also a spanner, or is that a wrench, and a screwdriver, and we've got a load of sculpt options here. We could turn on symmetry, which would be tapping on the X, and if I tap G for our grab sculpting tool, you can see that what I do on one side will happen on the other. And if I click and drag this menu on the side, you can see we've got all these different sculpting tools, and I think this is just about experimenting with how all those different things work. I tend to use draw, grab, snake hook, flatten, smooth, very smooth. But there's loads of things that you can experiment with. Now, as I've been sculpting, if I tab into edit mode, you can see that the geometry, it's got the same number of vertices. It hasn't changed the number. It's changed the location of the vertices, etc., but it hasn't actually added more or taken them away, which you may want. So what we can do to sculpt a little bit more organically is, if I scroll down here on the right, you can see this section here called Dyne Topo, which is short for dynamic topology. And if we click on that, it will give you a warning, just okay that. And now if I go to, let's say we use draw, and if I start to sculpt, and I should mention that holding down Control will also do sort of the inverse, so draw, subtract, smooth, and so on. Now if I jump into edit mode, you can see in dynamic topology it's changing the geometry and adding or taking away additional vertices. So if I go back to dynamic topology section, sometimes it will turn itself off, so be mindful of that. And you can add more detail by making this number smaller. But again, I don't go much lower than, say, 10 or 8. So now if I draw, you can see there's probably a little bit more precision. So it's just really about experimenting with the different tools, and yeah. And so on. Okay, let's just save that in case. So let's start a new file. general file. Let's look at importing your 3D objects into the scene. So that might be a scan or a 3D object made somewhere else. It may be in virtual reality. So what we want to do is let's just delete our cube with X, and then we want to go into our file, import, and you've got a load of different file formats for import. You might have an STL if it's a 3D scan, or an OBJ, and similarly you can export as these different objects, which could be useful when you're sending your files to GI. Okay, so let's import an STL just for an example. I'm going to go, I've got a simulation that was sent to me from GI. So when I first imported it, I can't see anything there. That could mean that it's either very, very, very small or very, very, very big. Let's zoom out. It's very, very, very big. Okay. Or you might have a case where you'll zoom in and it's tiny. You may want to scale it down. You may want to keep the file size the same. So what we can do, let's just zoom out to have a look at this. You can see that it kind of gets clipped. Let's just say I want to keep the file size the same so that it's consistent. If I tap on N, this brings up the side menu here. And if I go to view, you can see that it's clipping our view past a certain point. So let's just put the clip end point, let's just add a couple of zeros. And now we can see all of our objects. It's not clipping, because this is huge within Blender, it was sort of clipping the end of it. Okay, so now we've got an object with a lot of geometry. One thing we're going to look at is the 3D print tab. I don't think it's installed as standard, so next I'm going to look at is how to add add-ons to Blender. So if I tap Control and comma or Command and comma on a Mac, or I could go to Edit Preferences, and then I'm going to go to Add-ons, and if I start to type 3D print, you might see yours grayed out. So all you need to do is tick it, and it will add it to your menu. There are a lot of add-ons already preloaded into Blender. You just have to kind of activate them, but you can also install external ones. All you would need to do is download the zip and install it. But most things are within Blender. So now you should have this 3D print dialog. You can see if I click on check all, what that's going to do is it's going to analyze our object, and it will tell us if there are any errors in the file, and it will give us the option of cleaning it up. Some of this is pretty in-depth. You'll need to sort of get into Blender to understand the different things and how you fix them, but just as an overall, Blender is very good, depending on the file, at cleaning up your object. I've got all this information, and if I tap into edit mode, I can click on any of these things and it will show me where those errors are. Mostly if you've got non-manifold edges, that's a good sign that you have a solid object with no real errors in it. Tab back into object mode, and if we click on here, clean up, and click make manifold, if there are errors with your file, Blender can be quite efficient in cleaning that up. Depends on the file and depends on the errors. Another thing I want to look at is maybe you have a file that is a 3D scan that has a really high number of vertices, making it quite difficult to work with. It might be slowing your computer down, you might not be able to edit it. So let's go back into our modifier tab, and we want to go to generate decimate. So at the beginning there'll be no change to your object, but if we make the rate, so at the moment it's got 100% of its vertices, but what decimate will do is it will reduce the number of vertices but try and keep the form as much as possible. So if I go to say 0.5, it's going to reduce the number of vertices by half, and we can sort of have a look to see if you can see that it's actually kept a lot of the detail. Let's go really small, let's go 0.2. There's so many vertices actually that it's even at 0.2 you can see the form is pretty close. So let's go 0.01. Yeah, okay, you can see that it's simplified our object. Now if I apply this and okay that, you can see when it applies that we'll have an object with a lot less geometry, which can be useful depending on what you want to do. Let's just undo that for the purposes of the next exercise. Get rid of that. So we have our original STL. The next thing I want to show you is how to potentially, you might need to trim your object or take away elements of the scan. So I'm just going to add another object. Let's add a cube. I'm going to jump into edit mode and then I'm going to scale it. Just going to do it by eye. Scale it on the x-axis and scale it on the y-axis. Drag that out. We are working with a huge object here. I probably should have shrunk it down, but yeah, and if you do want to shrink it down so it fits within Blender more, do it in multiples of, tens or hundreds or thousands, so the scale is easy to work out when you're resizing it. I find that often, no matter what I set my settings at, it'll be the right size in Blender, and it'll come out 1,000 times too small or 1,000 times too big when GLA import it. That's pretty easy to deal with. Okay, so I've made a big cuboid, and let's just say that I wanted to trim. Just edit mode. I'm scaling, by the way, in edit mode, not in object mode, because we kind of want our object to be at a scale of 1, if that makes sense. Okay, so scale it a bit more just to make sure that those edges are covered. Next thing we need to do is add our bool tool. I don't think it's enabled as default, but if I go to our add-on menu, so Control and comma, Command and comma, and let's just clear that. And if I look for bool, as in Boolean function, what we want to do is make sure that the bool tool is checked. And what Boolean does is basically it will, between two objects, it will add, subtract or intersect between those two objects. So what we can do is, if I select the bool object and then our target, second, what I can then do is if I click on auto Boolean and difference, what that's going to do is slice that and take away that section there. If I undo that, you could similarly add to it. You might want to add a base or whatever, so let's do a union. You can see if I tab into edit mode, it's actually geometrically joined that up, so it's one solid object. And again, just to undo that and show you intersect. Intersect will be the area that those two objects overlap, which again can be useful depending on what you're doing. And then the last thing I'm going to show you, that's the way to apply your bool tool. You can actually have it as a modifier. So again, if I make sure that our bool object is selected first, then our target object, and if I add a Boolean, let's just go with difference, that's going to make it as a modifier, meaning it's something that we can adjust, move around without it being final. So you can see we've got our object here, our cube here is now sort of wireframed out, and we can click and move this and adjust it. It might be quite slow if you're working with the full resolution. And you can flip between intersect and union. Right, and then finally, if we wanted to export, this is, if you save this, it's a Blender file. You'll want to export this as a 3D file that GI can read, and I think an STL or an OBJ are fine, and you can export that like so. Okay, that's it for now. Like I say, just a very brief introduction. Happy sculpting.